Hello everyone, and welcome back to Terrifying Bedtime Tales. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. They told her the house was empty, abandoned for years. But as Ellie stood at the front door, the heavy thud of footsteps from inside sent a chill down her spine. There was no one there. At least, no one she could see. Jenna lay in bed, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The house was completely silent, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden beams settling. She hated how quiet it was at night, how the silence seemed to stretch on forever, amplifying every small sound, making the darkness feel heavier. In the dim glow of the moonlight streaming through the thin curtains, the shadows in her room seemed to move, as though they were alive, creeping closer with each passing minute. Her heart rate quickened as she shifted uncomfortably under the thick quilt, trying to push the unsettling thoughts from her mind. The house was old, so old in fact that it creaked and groaned like it was alive, full of secrets. She had never been able to shake the feeling that something was always just out of reach, lurking in the corners of her vision. It had been that way ever since they had moved in. Her parents had dismissed her fears, telling her that it was just the house settling. But Jenna knew better. She had heard the whispers, the faint scratching noises in the walls, the strange chill that never seemed to leave the hallways. Tonight was different though. Tonight, she could feel something or someone watching her. Her breath caught in her throat as she lay perfectly still, straining to hear any sound that might break the stillness. Then, just as she was beginning to convince herself it was all in her head, the phone rang. The shrill sound of the ringtone echoed through the silence, jarring her nerves. Jenna jumped, her heart skipping a beat. It was almost 2 a.m. Who would be calling this late? She stared at the glowing phone screen on her bedside table, the caller ID showing a number she didn't recognize. "Don't answer it," she whispered to herself, but her hand was already reaching for the device, almost as if it had a mind of its own. With a hesitant breath, she swiped to answer. "Hello." Her voice was barely a whisper, unsure of what to expect. For a moment, there was nothing but static on the other end. Then a soft, raspy voice emerged from the silence, sending a chill down Jenna's spine. "Jenna, help me." The voice was faint, almost like a whisper in the wind, but it was unmistakably real. Her heart pounded harder now, her pulse racing in her ears. Who could it be? The voice sounded so familiar, yet she couldn't place it. "Who is this?" Jenna asked, her voice trembling. She strained to hear any other words, but the line fell silent again, the only sound being the occasional crackle of static. Just as she was about to hang up, the voice spoke again. "Jenna, I need you to listen, they're coming." The phone line went dead. Jenna's hand fell limp at her side, the phone slipping from her fingers and landing softly on the bed. Her mind was racing. What had just happened? Who had called her? And what did they mean by their coming? She sat up in bed, her eyes darting to the door of her room. The house was still silent, but it felt different now, heavier, as though something was moving in the shadows, something waiting just outside her vision. Jenna's mind raced back to the old stories her grandmother used to tell her, tales of spirits and things that moved between the worlds. Her grandmother had always warned her to never ignore the strange feelings, the whispers in the dark. But those were just stories, weren't they? A sudden knock on her bedroom door startled her out of her thoughts. "Jenna," her mother's voice called from the other side. "Are you okay?" Jenna's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't heard her mother come upstairs. She quickly wiped the sweat from her palms and answered, her voice shaking. I'm fine, Mom. Just a bad dream, I guess." There was a pause before her mother responded. "Okay, honey. Well, try to get some sleep. If you need anything, you know where I am." Jenna listened as her mother's footsteps retreated down the hallway, leaving her alone once again with the eerie silence. The phone call replayed in her mind, each word lingering like a shadow. She stood up from the bed and walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside just a crack to peer into the night. The street outside was empty, bathed in the pale light of the moon. Nothing seemed out of place, yet everything felt wrong. Then, as her gaze swept over the yard, something caught her eye. A figure, standing motionless at the edge of the trees. A shadow in the darkness. Jenna's breath caught in her throat. Was it a person? She squinted, trying to make out any details, but the figure was too far away. The figure didn't move, not even an inch. A shiver ran down her spine as she pulled the curtain back into place, her heart pounding. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, nothing more than a trick of the night. But the feeling lingered. The weight of the silence, the sense that she wasn't alone, that something was watching her, waiting. And then the phone rang again. Jenna's heart lurched as the phone began to ring again, the same haunting melody cutting through the oppressive silence. She froze, her hand hovering over the receiver, her breath shallow. Her instincts screamed at her not to pick up, but she couldn't bring herself to ignore it, not after what had happened the first time. With trembling hands, she reached for the phone again, dreading the voice that would greet her on the other end. She took a deep breath and answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hello." The same static-filled silence greeted her for a moment, and then the voice came, slow and deliberate. "Jenna, they're closer now. Don't trust anyone. You have to hide." The line went dead once more. Her pulse raced, a mix of fear and confusion swirling in her gut. Hide? Who was this person? And why were they telling her to hide? And what did they mean by they? Her mind spun with questions. But one thing was clear. This was no ordinary prank call. She could feel it deep in her bones. She stood there for a moment, gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. Every instinct told her to run, to leave the house, but the weight of the situation kept her rooted to the spot. What if this was real? What if the threat was out there, waiting, just like the figure she had seen in the yard? Jenna's eyes darted back to the window. The figure was gone now, but the unease remained. She felt like the walls of the house were closing in on her, suffocating her. The silence was no longer comforting. It was oppressive, filled with unseen dangers. She needed to do something, but what? Without thinking, she grabbed the phone again and dialed the first number that came to her mind. Her best friend, Leah. Leah had always been the rational one, the one who knew how to handle situations like this. Maybe she would have an explanation, or at least offer some comfort. The phone rang twice before Leah's groggy voice answered. "Jenna, it's really late. What's going on?" I don't know what to do," Jenna blurted out. "Something's wrong. I just got another call." The same voice, it said I had to hide. It said. She was cut off by Leah's sharp intake of breath. "What? Jenna, this is really freaky. Are you sure you're okay? Are you sure you're just not overthinking things?" "I'm not overthinking. The first time maybe, but now it's like something's watching me. I saw someone outside, or maybe I didn't, I don't know. Leah, I'm scared." Leah was quiet for a moment, her voice softening. Okay, just take a deep breath. You're probably just freaking yourself out. You said you saw someone outside? Maybe it was just some animal or, I don't know, a neighbor? I don't think it was. It was too still, too unnatural. Leah, I don't know what's going on, but I can't ignore it anymore. All right, listen. Stay calm. Do you want me to come over? I can be there in like 10 minutes. Jenna hesitated. It felt good to hear Leah's voice, to have someone to rely on, but even as she considered it, her eyes flicked back to the phone, to the call she had just received. "Please, Leah," Jenna whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm scared." "Okay, don't worry, I'm on my way. Just lock all your doors and windows. Don't open the door for anyone but me, understand?" Jenna nodded, even though Leah couldn't see her. She was about to respond when something in the hallway caught her eye. A shadow passing by, long and twisting. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat. "Jenna, you still there?" The shadow didn't stop, it just kept moving, slowly but steadily, like it was drifting toward her. Jenna's heart slammed in her chest. "Leah, I have to go. Someone's in the house." "Wait, what?" "Jenna." But Jenna had already hung up. Her legs felt like jelly as she scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. She knew she should have locked the door earlier, but the house had felt so safe, so quiet. Now, the silence felt like a trap. Jenna hurried to the door, double-checking the locks, even though she knew they wouldn't keep anyone out if they really wanted to get in. She backed away from the door, her eyes darting to every corner of the room. The shadows seemed to grow longer as the house grew darker, more oppressive. Then, without warning, the lights flickered. Once, twice, and then they went out completely. The entire house was plunged into darkness. Jenna froze, her breathing shallow, panic rising in her chest. The silence was now deafening, the kind that made her skin crawl. She reached blindly for her phone, the glow from the screen offering a small measure of comfort. She turned on the flashlight, but the beam barely cut through the thick shadows surrounding her. She needed to get out. The door. She had to lock the door. But as she stepped toward the hallway, she heard it, a soft, steady scratching sound from the walls, followed by a faint whisper. "Jenna, come closer." The whisper was so close it sent a jolt of terror through her. She froze, her blood turning cold. "Jenna, don't run." She spun around, looking wildly for the source of the voice, but there was nothing, no one. The house was empty, or at least it should have been. The scratching sound started again, louder now, closer. Something was moving inside the walls. Jenna's pulse raced as she backed away, her mind screaming for her to get out, to run. But where? The house was full of shadows, full of things she couldn't see, couldn't understand. The walls began to groan, as if something large and heavy was shifting inside them. The floor beneath her feet seemed to tremble, as though the house itself was alive, reacting to whatever presence was stalking her. And then, suddenly, the phone rang again. The phone rang a fourth time, its shrill tones slicing through the tension that had taken root in Jenna's chest. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a split second, she was frozen, unable to move, unable to think. This time, there was no static, no silence, just a voice so familiar, yet so distant, it made her heart stop. "Jenna, it's me." Her father's voice crackled, barely audible, yet it cut through the oppressive dark like a knife. "You have to listen. It is coming for you." The words were barely a whisper, but they were clear enough to freeze Jenna in place. Her father had been away on a business trip for the past week. How could he be calling from here? The voice sounded like it was coming from right beside her, yet the phone was held tightly to her ear. "Dad?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. "Is that you?" The voice on the other end quivered. "Jenna, listen carefully. They're already inside. You're not alone. Don't trust the walls. Don't trust the silence. You need to run now." A crackling noise interrupted the voice. Then the phone went dead once more. Jenna's hands shook uncontrollably as she dropped the phone, the words echoing in her mind. They're already inside. What was her father trying to tell her? Was someone in the house with her right now? Was it all some sick prank? Or was it something worse? Her breath came in shallow gasps as her mind raced. She couldn't make sense of it. She couldn't even think straight. She needed to get out. Jenna turned toward the door again, but before she could make a single move, she heard it. The distinct sound of something scraping across the floor in the hallway just outside her room. The sound was low and rhythmic, almost like nails on the floor, a soft drag that made her skin prickle with dread. It's close. Her body was frozen, locked in place by fear. Her eyes darted to the window, but the dark outside revealed nothing. The shadows were too thick, too oppressive. She needed to do something, anything, but her limbs felt like they were made of lead. And then the scraping stopped. Silence. For a long moment, there was no sound at all. The stillness was suffocating, a blanket of dread pressing down on her chest. Jenna didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, for fear that even the smallest sound would give away her position. Then a knock, soft, gentle, like someone's knuckles lightly tapping against the wood. Jenna's heart leapt into her throat. She couldn't tell where it was coming from. Was it the door? Or was it the walls? The scratching, the knocks. It felt like the house itself was alive, watching her, waiting. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides as she struggled to keep her breathing steady. She knew, deep down, that there was no one on the other side of the door. No one, but something else. "Jenna," the whisper came again, so soft it was almost a breath against her ear. It was inside her mind now. It wasn't just a voice. It was a presence. "It's coming for you." Her skin tingled with cold fear, and she could feel the weight of whatever it was pressing down on her, wrapping around her like tendrils of darkness. Without warning, the lights flickered back on. The harsh, blinding brightness flooded the room, but the sense of terror didn't lift. It only deepened. In the stark light, everything seemed too clear, too sharp. The shadows, the corners, the way the walls themselves seemed to breathe. Jenna could feel it. The air had changed. Something was wrong. The knocking came again, but this time it wasn't at the door. It was behind her, from the direction of the closet. She spun around in panic, her eyes wide with terror. She couldn't see anything through the open closet door, but something was there. She could feel it. Suddenly, the closet door creaked open. Jenna's body tensed, her heart hammering in her chest. She wanted to run, wanted to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in. Then, in the dim light spilling from a closet, she saw it. A figure hunched and crooked, emerging slowly from the darkness inside the closet. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, its eyes empty voids that seemed to swallow the light. Its limbs were unnaturally long, stretching and bending as it crawled forward, its twisted hands dragging across the floor. Jenna stumbled backward, her breath coming in sharp gasps, but there was nowhere to run. The figure lurched closer, its movements erratic and jerky, like something not entirely human. "Jenna," the voice from a phone, her father's voice, came again, distorted and rasping, but it wasn't comforting now. It was cold. It was wrong. "You can't run. We've already found you." The figure stopped just a few feet away from her, its dark, hollow eyes locking onto hers. It opened its mouth, revealing teeth too sharp, too many, as it let out a low, guttural growl that sent shivers of dread down her spine. Jenna's feet finally found their movement, and she bolted for the door, ignoring the pounding in her chest, ignoring the screams of terror that tried to escape her throat. She threw herself into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind her. But as she ran, she realized something terrible. The house was no longer silent. The walls whispered, the floors groaned, and all around her, in the shadows that clung to the corners of the house, they were waiting. Jenna's heart pounded in her ears as she sprinted down the dark hallway, her bare feet slapping against the cold wooden floor. She barely registered the way the old house seemed to distort around her. The walls seemed to shift, the ceiling sagging lower as though the house itself was closing in on her, trying to swallow her whole. The air was thick, each breath more suffocating than the last. She didn't dare look back, not even once. The front door was just ahead. She could see it now, bathed in the faint glow from the streetlights outside. It seemed so far away, though, as if it were taunting her with its unreachable distance. She pushed herself harder, ignoring the burn in her legs, but the fear weighed her down like lead. Just a few more steps. Suddenly, a loud bang sounded behind her, like a door slamming open with violent force. Her heart leapt into her throat, her legs threatening to give way beneath her. She glanced over her shoulder despite herself, and that was her mistake. A figure was standing at the end of the hallway, the same twisted, hunched shape she had seen in the closet. Its pale skin gleamed in the faint light, its long limbs distorted in ways that were not natural. Its hollow eyes locked onto hers, and she could see the empty darkness swirling inside them, drawing her in, suffocating her. "Jenna." The whisper was low, guttural, like something that belonged to the very shadows. It was the same voice, her father's voice, except this time it was filled with something unrecognizable, something cold and otherworldly. The figure began to move toward her, its limbs jerking and shifting unnaturally. The floorboards creaked beneath its weight, and the air grew colder, so cold it stung her lungs with each breath. "Run. Don't look back." She forced herself to look forward, her mind racing. Her body, however, had already moved ahead of her thoughts. Her legs pushed her faster, but no matter how fast she ran, It felt like the figure was gaining on her, closing the distance with every breath she took. The front door loomed ahead, just inches away. She reached for the handle, her fingers trembling as she yanked it down, but nothing. The door wouldn't budge. Panic surged through her. The door had been unlocked earlier. She was sure of it. She yanked harder, her nails digging into the wood, but the door remained firmly shut. Behind her, she heard the creak of footsteps, slow and deliberate, closing in. The whispers were louder now, filling her mind, twisting her thoughts into a knot of fear. You can't escape. The figure stopped just behind her, its breath, if it could even be called that, ragged and deep, hot against the back of her neck. Jenna froze, her skin prickling, her heart hammering so loud she was sure it would give her away. She tried the door again, but this time she could hear it, a low, menacing growl rising from deep within the figure's throat. A deep, guttural sound that felt like a warning. The growl reverberated through the floor, through the walls. Jenna, the voice was closer now, almost in her ear, though the figure hadn't moved. It was as though it was inside her mind, inside her very thoughts. You can't hide from them anymore. The growl intensified. It was louder than before, an animalistic sound that rattled her bones. Something in the air shifted, and with a sudden, terrible certainty, Jenna knew. The house had become its own creature, its own prison. Whatever was hunting her wasn't just inside her mind. It was inside the walls, inside the house itself. Suddenly, the floor beneath her feet shifted, sending a tremor through the house. The lights flickered wildly, casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. The walls groaned, as if the house itself was stretching, breathing, alive in ways she couldn't comprehend. The scratching sound from earlier resumed, louder now, as if something was clawing from the inside out. Jenna's breath came in sharp, desperate gasps as she tried one more time to wrench open the door. Please, please. And then, with an unearthly screech, the door gave way. It burst open with such force that it slammed against the wall, the impact shaking the entire house. The light from outside spilled in, flooding the hallway with the pale glow of the streetlights. But even then, it felt as though the darkness inside the house still clung to her, wrapping around her like a suffocating shroud. Without thinking, Jenna bolted through the door. She ran into the cold night air, her feet hitting the ground hard. The house loomed behind her, dark and foreboding. The sound of the door slamming shut echoed in the quiet, but the relief didn't last. She felt it, the presence, still lurking just behind her, waiting for her to look back. The street was empty. The world around her was still, but the shadows felt alive, moving, twisting in the periphery of her vision. Was it real? Was she really free? Or had the house just let her go, allowing her to run, only to trap her elsewhere? A cold gust of wind swept through the street, sending a chill across her skin. Her feet carried her forward, one step at a time, her breath coming out in jagged bursts. But as she moved farther from the house, something seemed to change. The ground beneath her feet began to feel wrong. Her legs slowed, her head spun. Suddenly, the sound of a phone ringing cut through the night air. Jenna froze. The ringing wasn't from her phone. No, it was from behind her. The sound was unmistakable. It was coming from the house. A voice she knew all too well came next, faint but unmistakable, slicing through the quiet night. Jenna, we're waiting. The words sent a rush of panic through her, and she felt her legs give way beneath her. She collapsed to the ground, her mind struggling to keep up with what was happening. Was it real? Was she still inside the house? Had it followed her? No, she couldn't go back. She wouldn't go back. But the ringing continued, closer now, almost as if it were following her. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift and churn, and with each step, the road ahead began to blur. She looked back once more. The house was gone. In its place stood only the empty street, the same cold wind swirling through the air. But the presence, it was still there, watching, waiting. And the phone, the call, the voice, it was still coming for her. Absolutely. Let's dive deeper into the tension and mystery unraveling more of the terror Jenna is facing. Jenna's heart hammered in her chest, her breaths ragged as she stood frozen on the empty street. The phone's ringing continued, now sharp and insistent, echoing through the stillness of the night. Her eyes darted around, trying to make sense of what was happening. The house had vanished, gone, as if it had never existed at all, but the eerie presence still lingered in the air, like a heavy fog pressing down on her. The ringing was closer now, impossibly so. Her eyes flicked to her phone in her hand, still silent, but the ringing continued, louder than before, almost as if it were coming from all around her. But how? Jenna, the voice whispered again, low and rasping. It was unmistakable now, her father's voice, though distorted, broken by static and something far darker. You thought you could escape. She could feel the coldness creeping into her bones, seeping through the soles of her feet and rising up her legs, like icy fingers curling around her spine. The voice wasn't just speaking to her, it was inside her, wrapping around her thoughts, tugging at the edges of her sanity. Her head spun. Was she still inside the house? Was she dreaming? The world felt wrong, twisted, distorted. She could feel the cold, the fear, the overwhelming sense that the darkness had bled out of the walls and into the very air around her. No, she couldn't stay here. She had to move, run, get away, go somewhere, anywhere. With shaking legs, Jenna pushed herself up, taking unsteady steps forward. The sound of the phone's incessant ringing continued to follow her, no matter how fast she moved. It felt like the entire world was closing in on her, the shadows warping and flickering, and the air growing colder with every passing second. Then, a flash of movement caught her eye. She whirled around, her pulse skyrocketing. The street behind her was still empty, but the shadows shifted. No, twisted. Something was there. Something moving just out of her sight. It's not over. Her breath hitched. The voice that had been taunting her all night returned, now laced with a deeper malice. Jenna, we're not done. The shadows shifted again, this time more pronounced, like black smoke crawling along the edges of the street. It felt like the ground beneath her was pulling her back, as if some unseen force was drawing her toward the darkness, toward the phone's endless ringing. She took another step forward, her legs trembling with the effort, but her mind screamed for her to stop. She had to get away. She had to leave this place before it consumed her. But with every step, the ringing grew louder, more urgent, echoing in her ears like an unbearable crescendo of dread. Then, without warning, the phone rang again, but this time, it wasn't from her pocket. It was coming from the air itself, from the darkened corners of the street, as though the phone was embedded into the very fabric of the world around her. Jenna, the voice, now impossibly close, was a rasping whisper in her ear, as though the speaker was standing right behind her, breathing down her neck. She spun around so quickly she nearly lost her balance, but when she looked, there was nothing. No one. The street, the world around her, had become a maze of swirling shadows, every corner warped and unfamiliar. Her stomach churned with nausea. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. And yet, the fear gnawed at her insides, relentless. The shadows weren't just moving, they were closing in on her, squeezing the very air out of her lungs, suffocating her with their dark presence. We're here. The whisper came again, this time louder, more distinct, as if the shadows themselves had learned to speak. The phone rang again, louder now, a shrill, unyielding cry that seemed to tear through the silence. You're not alone. Jenna stumbled backward, her mind racing. The house, the phone calls, the shadows. Was this some kind of dream? Some nightmare she couldn't escape? Had she lost her grip on reality? Or was there something? Someone following her, playing with her mind? A low growl filled the air, a sound so deep it seemed to reverberate through the ground, shaking her bones. She looked down to see the shadows at her feet, twisting and writhing like serpents, reaching for her ankles. Panic surged through her as she tried to pull away, but the shadows tightened their grip, dragging her closer to the ground. The phone continued its ringing, its shrill cry echoing from all directions, until it became impossible to ignore. The shadows were now all around her, smothering her, and the voice was no longer just a whisper. It was a roar in her mind, louder, overwhelming. Jenna. The voice was everywhere, inside her now, resonating through her chest, her mind. We are waiting. The shadows twisted and coiled around her, pulling her toward the ground, pulling her into the earth itself. Her breath came in short, panic gasps, her heart pounding as the phone's ringing began to distort, becoming a jarring, nightmarish sound that rattled her to the core. No, no, Jenna screamed, clawing at the ground beneath her. Her fingers scrabbled desperately, but the earth seemed to shift under her hands, slipping away like sand. The shadows pulled tighter, dragging her toward something far deeper, far darker than the world she knew. Her vision blurred. The street disappeared, swallowed by an endless expanse of darkness. And then everything went silent. The shadows, the growling, the voice, all faded into nothing. There was no ringing, no whisper, no more movement, just an eerie, absolute silence. Jenna's breathing slowed, the panic subsiding just a little as she opened her eyes. She was somewhere else. She was lying on cold, smooth ground, surrounded by an impenetrable blackness. No stars, no moon, just an endless void. Was this it? She struggled to sit up, feeling the weight of an oppressive stillness around her, pressing down on her chest. Her heart still raced, but she was no longer sure if she was alive. She wasn't sure if anything around her was real. Suddenly, a faint light appeared in the distance, so faint it could have been a trick of her mind, but it was growing brighter, closer. She scrambled toward it, her legs weak beneath her, her body still trembling with the fear that had consumed her. And then, as she neared the light, she stopped dead in her tracks. The phone began to ring again, but this time it wasn't from the shadows. It wasn't from the void. It was coming from the light. Jenna, her father's voice. She couldn't breathe. Jenna's legs buckled beneath her as the voice, her father's voice, rang out again, distorted and echoing in the void. She wanted to move, to run, but her body felt heavy, weighed down by the air itself. The faint light in front of her flickered like a dying flame, but there was something almost comforting about it, something familiar, even though her gut told her that whatever lay ahead was not salvation. Her mind screamed for her to turn away, to flee back into the endless darkness where at least she wouldn't be drawn in, swallowed whole by whatever force waited for her. But the light called to her, and the voice, though broken and distorted, still sounded like a lifeline, like it was trying to reach her from some far-off place. Jenna, come closer. The ringing of the phone intensified, reverberating through her chest, its sound sharp and insistent, dragging her forward like a tether, pulling her closer to the light. Every instinct in her screamed to resist, to run the other way, but the light seemed to have a magnetic pull, as though it was the only thing left in a world that had vanished around her. She took a step, then another. Her body was stiff, her breath shallow. But as she moved closer, the air around her grew warmer, and the oppressive heaviness seemed to lift just slightly. Maybe this is what I need, she thought, even as the knot of dread in her stomach twisted tighter. The light grew brighter, almost blinding now, but Jenna couldn't stop. She didn't know if she even wanted to. The voice spoke again, and this time it wasn't just her father. It was a chorus, faint whispers, a multitude of voices speaking at once, as though they were all around her. Jenna, we've been waiting for you. It's time. Her pulse raced. Her hands shook as she reached out toward the light, her fingers brushing against the edge of its glow. The warmth felt almost alive. But just as she touched the light, something shifted, the air crackling around her like static. The voices stopped. The phone in her hand, which she hadn't realized she was still holding, rang one final time. Jenna's heart skipped a beat. She didn't want to answer it. She couldn't. Her breath caught in her throat as she hesitated, staring at the screen. It was an unknown number. Her father's voice again, clear and sharp, echoed in her mind. Don't answer it. Whatever you do, don't pick up the phone. She froze. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to follow his warning, to drop the phone and run. But the pull of the light was so strong. Her fingers trembled as they hovered over the screen. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her mind spinning. The phone rang again. One more time. Each ring felt like it was a second from breaking her. The light in front of her seemed to pulse in time with each ring. "Jenna, please." And then she answered. The sound that came through the phone was unlike anything she'd ever heard. It was a mix of static and whispers, a cacophony of voices, but all of them were her father's, his voice distorting, fragmenting into pieces. "Jenna, no." Before she could react, the phone call suddenly went silent. The world around her shifted. The light, which had been so warm and inviting, morphed into something more sinister. It twisted, darkened, and the edges of it began to flicker like a broken bulb. The whispering voices grew louder again, this time becoming distorted, incomprehensible, like 100 people talking at once, their words crashing together in a maddening symphony. "Jenna," they whispered. "It's already too late." She tried to run. Her legs moved, but they were heavy, sluggish. Her feet stumbled over the shifting ground, which had turned slick and unstable. The light, once a beacon of hope, now felt like a trap, a snare that had pulled her in. And then she heard it, the sound of the floor cracking beneath her feet. She looked down just as the ground began to split wide open, a black abyss yawning beneath her, swallowing everything in its path. "Jenna, come to us." The voice, her father's voice, no longer sounded comforting. It was cold, like an order. The light flickered one last time, revealing something even worse. Shadows crawling, twisting out the cracks in the earth, stretching toward her with long, sharp claws. The phone dropped from her hand. She screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. She stumbled back, her feet sinking into the abyss, the shadows closing in on her. The ground disappeared beneath her as she was consumed by the void. The light, the whispers, the cold voice, they all faded into nothing. And as everything went silent, there was no longer any trace of her. The silent caller had taken its final claim. As the darkness consumed Jenna, she felt weightless, her body dissolving into the void. There was no sound now, no voices, no phone calls, just an oppressive silence that pressed down on her chest, heavy and suffocating. She had no idea how long she fell. Time felt irrelevant here, in this strange in-between place where light and shadow merged into something darker than either. Her thoughts were a blur, fragments of memories, broken images. Her father's face twisted with something unrecognizable, something sinister. But then, all at once, she stopped falling. The sensation of weight returned, her feet sinking into something soft. The air was still cold, but it felt different now, stale, thick with the scent of decay. Slowly, Jenna opened her eyes, blinking against the dim light that surrounded her. She was no longer in the void. She was in a room. The walls were cracked and peeling, the ceiling low, and the air was damp. The place felt familiar. The house? She took a shaky breath, trying to stand, but her legs wouldn't obey. Instead, she crawled forward, her hands brushing against the cold, rough floor. It was the house. It had to be, but it wasn't the same. The house was twisted here, everything warped and broken. The furniture was overturned, the rooms empty, and the floor was stained with something that looked far too much like blood. And then, from the corner of the room, a soft, rhythmic sound. A phone. Her phone. The phone was lying on the floor beside her, still ringing, its display cracked but still glowing. The silent caller. Jenna's hands shook as she reached out to grab the phone. She didn't want to answer it, she couldn't, but her fingers moved almost of their own accord, and she pressed it to her ear. A silence, cold and suffocating, greeted her. Then the voice. Jenna. Her father's voice, smooth and calm, like it had been when she was a child. But something was wrong. The words, they weren't right. "You're home now." Jenna's pulse raced. Home? She looked around, her eyes darting to the cracked walls, the empty rooms. She wasn't home. She was lost. She had fallen into something darker than the house. This was the house. The house had always been this way. The voice continued, but this time there was something in it, an edge, a finality. "You'll never leave." Jenna's heart pounded in her chest. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the emptiness. The phone call ended abruptly. The silence that followed was suffocating. Her eyes darted to the door. She had to leave. She had to get out. She staggered to her feet, every movement clumsy and uncoordinated, as if the house itself was pressing against her, trying to hold her back. The walls groaned. The floor beneath her feet creaked ominously as she made her way to the door. It wasn't locked. She reached for the handle, the cold metal biting into her skin. She yanked the door open and stopped. The hallway outside wasn't the hallway she knew. It was the same twisted, decaying version of the house, the one that felt alive, that pulsed with a malevolent energy. The lights flickered overhead, casting long, twitching shadows across the floor. And there, standing at the far end of the hallway, was a figure. The figure of her father. His form was distorted, his face hollow and pale, eyes dark and sunken. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, waiting, watching. "You can't leave." The voice was clear now, but it wasn't his voice. It was something else, something ancient and wrong. The figure didn't move, but it didn't need to. The air around it was thick with a presence so oppressive that Jenna could barely breathe. Her father's figure flickered, as if he was trapped between two worlds. He was an echo of what had once been, and that echo was the thing that had haunted her. That thing had been pulling her, guiding her, until now, until she had no choice but to fall into its grasp. Jenna stumbled backward, her eyes wide, the cold grip of terror closing around her heart. No, she couldn't stay. She couldn't be here. "You're not who you think you are." The words cut through her like ice, the truth sinking in with a chilling clarity. She wasn't running from the house. The house had never let her go. It had been pulling her in from the very beginning, every night, every whisper on the phone, every step she took closer to the darkness. It had been waiting for her to come back. And now there was no escape. She reached out toward the door again, her breath ragged. But the hallway had changed. It stretched impossibly long, the door shrinking away from her, until the figure of her father was the only thing that remained in her vision. She ran toward him, but her legs grew heavier with each step. The hallway grew longer, the walls narrowing around her. And then, as she reached out for him, he vanished. The house shifted again, warping into a nightmarish reflection of the place she had once known, and she was no longer in control. The phone rang once more. It rang louder, almost deafening now. Answer it. She had no choice. The phone slipped from her hand, and as it hit the floor, everything went black. The house was silent once more, but Jenna was still there, still waiting, still trapped. Her father's voice had been the last sound she heard, and now every phone that rang, every whisper that echoed through the walls, was her call to answer. The silent caller had claimed its final victim, and the house was still waiting. And with that, the story ends. The cycle of fear, the relentless presence of the house, and the mystery of the silent caller all merge into an eternal trap, where escape is never truly possible.